Most entrepreneurs believe separation happens at formation. They believe the moment the entity exists, their personal identity steps back and the business steps forward. That belief is wrong. In this episode, I'm going to explain how institutions actually determine whether a business is separate from its owner, and why most structures fail the test without anyone ever realizing it. It's not wrong because the filing was invalid, nor is it wrong because the entity doesn't exist. It's wrong because separation is not a filing event. There must be a transfer of authority, and most businesses never complete that transfer. When people say, "My business is separate," what they usually mean is there is a different name on the paperwork, there's a different account for money, there is a different set of documents on file. Those things create distinction. They don't create separation. Distinction is visual. Separation, though, is functional. If the business still depends on you to think, decide, approve, move money, sign, and absorb risk, then the business is not separate from you. It's decorated differently. And that distinction matters more than people want to admit. The illusion of separation feels real because nothing contradicts it at first. You can operate for years without challenge. Money can move, contracts can be signed, revenue can grow. Comfort in the absence of friction hides the structural truth. Institutions don't test separation during comfort. They test it during contradiction. And until contradiction arrives, the illusion holds and supports the false confidence. That's why founders say, everything was fine until, well, it wasn't fine. It just wasn't questioned yet. Separation is not a filing. It's a transfer of authority. And if authority never moved, separation never happened. Repeat that until it becomes uncomfortable, because discomfort is the signal that you're touching the truth. Institutions don't care how separation feels to you. They care whether the business can operate independently of you. Can it bind itself? Can it obligate itself? Can it act without personal intervention? And if the answer is no, the business is going to be treated as an extension of you, regardless of how many documents exist. And that's not punitive, it's practical. Institutions measure what they can verify, and behavior is easier to verify than paperwork. The first failure point is always the same. The owner never stopped being the business. They never stopped deciding. They never stopped approving. They never stopped absorbing. The entity existed. The transfer never happened. And that's where separation quietly failed. Think about this. If separation were automatic, institutions wouldn't need to examine it. The fact that they do tells you everything. In the next section, we're going to slow this down further and look at where separation is supposed to begin and why most businesses miss that moment entirely. If your business never became separate from you, it wasn't because you chose the wrong entity. It was because authority never moved. Ownership and authority are often treated as the same thing, but they're not. And confusing them is one of the most common reasons separation fails, even in businesses that look well structured on paper. Ownership answers a narrow question. Who legally holds the interest? That's it. Ownership determines entitlement, economic benefit, residual value. It doesn't determine who decides, who directs, who binds, who absorbs operational consequence. Most entrepreneurs treat ownership as if it does all of those things, but it doesn't. Ownership is passive by default. Authority is active by necessity. And separation depends on activity, not entitlement. Authority answers a different question altogether. Who has the recognized power to act? Not emotionally, not informally, not in practice. Recognized. Authority determines who can commit the business, who can move the resources, who can change direction, and who can create obligation. Institutions are not going to infer authority, they look for it. And if the authority is unclear, they assumed it remained personal. That's not a hostile assumption. It's efficient. If the business can't act without you, then it's not separate from you. If the business can't act without you, then it's not separate from you. That statement alone explains more separation failures than most people want to admit. Entrepreneurs collapse ownership and authority because it feels logical. I own it, so I decide. That logic works socially. It fails institutionally. Institutions don't care who should decide. They care who did decide. If every meaningful action traces back to the same individual, authority is treated as personal, regardless of the ownership structure. This is why entities with multiple documents, accounts, and agreements still collapse into personal exposure. Paperwork says one thing, behavior says another. Institutions believe behavior. Authority problems stay invisible during comfort. As long as no one challenges the decisions, authority feels irrelevant. But when pressure arrives, disputes, freezes, transitions, exits, authority becomes the only question that matters. Who had the right to act? Not who thought they did, not who intended to. Who can prove it? That's when separation is either confirmed or denied. And that determined is rarely generous. Ownership without authority is simply exposure disguised as structure. Authority without documentation is authority that defaults back to the individual. Separation only begins when authority moves and stays moved. In the next section, we'll follow authority into the place it most often collapses back into personal identity. Money. If authority is where separation is supposed to begin, money is where separation most often collapses. Not because people are careless, not because they intend to blur the lines, but because money feels practical. And practicality is where structure quietly dissolves. This section explains why institutions treat money movement as identity evidence and why separation that survives on paper often collapses the moment funds move. Entrepreneurs tend to think of money as fuel. It comes in, it goes out, it keeps things moving. Institutions think of money differently. They treat money as proof of control. Who can move money without permission? Who decides when it moves? Who benefits when it moves? Who absorbs consequence when it moves? Those questions are never theoretical. Money answers them automatically. That's why institutions start with financial flow before they look at anything else. Money doesn't explain itself, it reveals behavior. And here's the pattern that repeats across industries and borders. The business has its own account. The entity name is correct. The setup looks clean. But one person controls all movement. They decide when money comes in. They decide when it goes out. They decide what gets paid and what waits. No approval process, no delegated authority, no documented limits. From the entrepreneur's perspective, this feels efficient. But from the institution's perspective, this looks personal. Because control didn't move. The account belongs to the business. The authority over it did not. The authority stayed with the individual. That distinction is subtle and decisive. Money follows authority, and authority follows behavior. That's why financial flow becomes identity evidence under review. People often say, what they mean is different accounts, different cards, different names. Institutions don't stop there. They look at who initiated the transactions, who approved the exceptions, who resolved the shortfalls, who backstopped the losses. If every answer points to the same individual, separation never occurred. It doesn't matter how many accounts exist. Accounts record activity. They don't create independence. Independence exists only when the system can operate without personal intervention. Most identity collapse happens through exceptions. Temporary transfer, a short-term cover, a quick decision, just this once. Each exception feels harmless, but institutions don't evaluate exceptions emotionally. They evaluate patterns. One exception is an anomaly. Repeated exceptions are behavior. And behavior is what gets attributed. This is how personal identity quietly reattaches to business activity, not through fraud or misuse, but through convenience. Money flow issues rarely appear until something goes wrong. A dispute, a freeze, transition, or a review. That's when institutions reconstruct history. Not intent, not explanations. History. And history is written in transactions. Money doesn't care about your structure. It follows authority. If authority never left you, money proves it. In the next section, we'll move into the place where identity is reattached even faster than money. Contracts, guarantees, and obligation. That's where separation often collapses beyond repair. If money is where identity collapses through motion, contracts are where identity reattaches through agreement. This is the part most entrepreneurs misunderstand. They believe contracts protect the business. They believe guarantees are temporary. They believe obligation can be handled later. Institutions view contract as confessions. This section explains why separation often collapses the moment obligation is formalized, even when everything else looks structured. Contracts don't record intent. They record who agreed to be responsible. Not philosophically, not morally, legally and institutionally. When a contract is reviewed, institutions ask, who bound the obligation? Who had the authority to do so? And who ultimately stood behind performance? If the answer is the individual, separation is overridden. Not challenged, not pierced, overridden. Because the contract answers the authority question directly. Most entrepreneurs treat guarantees as a formality. Something required, something expected, something they'll replace later. Institutions treat guarantees as identity declarations. A guarantee says, if this fails, I stand behind it. That statement doesn't expire emotionally. It's going to persist institutionally. Even when the guarantee feels narrow, even when it feels strategic, even when it feels unavoidable. Once identity is attached in writing, separation weakens immediately. Not because guarantees are wrong, but because they recenter authority and consequence on the individual. Obligations reveal where institutions believe responsibility lives. And that belief doesn't change easily. Entrepreneurs often say, this is just temporary. This is just to get started. This is just until the business grows. Institutions don't evaluate duration. They evaluate existence. If the individual stepped in once, the question becomes, why wouldn't they step in again? That's not suspicion. That's pattern recognition. Temporary decisions create permanent inference. And inference drives attribution. One contract rarely stands alone. Contracts stack, obligations compound, authority change form. If the first link in that chain is personal, the rest of the chain inherits that assumption. This is how identity stays attached long after the original reason disappears. The business grows, the contracts expand, but the original point remains the same. Personal. Once obligation is attached personally, institutions don't rush to detach it. They require a clear redelegation, consistent non-intervention, documented independence over time. Until then, the safest assumption remains. Responsibility lives where it first appeared. Again, that's not punitive, that's conservative. Institutions are designed to preserve certainty, not experiment with separation. Contracts don't just describe business relationships. They describe belief. Belief about who stands behind performance. Belief about who absorbs failure. Belief about where responsibility lives. Once that belief is established, separation becomes difficult to restore. In the next section, we'll look at what finally exposes all of this: stress events that force institutions to decide definitively whether the business is separate or personal. Structure doesn't fail when things are calm. It fails when something interrupts normal operations. That interruption is not the cause of failure. It's simply the test. This section explains why stress events don't create non-separation. They reveal it. And entrepreneurs often think of stress as a catastrophe. Institutions do not. A stress event is anything that forces a decision outside of the ordinary flow. That can include a dispute, a freeze, a transition, a review, an incapacity, a death, an exit, or a counterparty challenge. None of these are dramatic by institutional standards. They're routine. And routine events are where structures are tested. Institutions don't continuously monitor your structure. They assume it works until something contradicts that assumption. And when contradiction appears, the question becomes simple. Who can act right now? Not who should, not who plans to, not even who will later. Who has recognized authority in the moment? If that answer is unclear, the institution doesn't wait for clarity. It defaults. And the default is the individual. Stress doesn't change structure. It reveals it. Say that again. Stress doesn't change structure. It's going to reveal it. And everything else in this section flows from that truth. During a stress event, institutions don't move cautiously. They move conservatively. Conservatism means freezing authority, limiting discretion, preserving the status quo. If authority lived personally before the event, it stays personal. If authority lives structurally, it stays structural. Stress doesn't reorganize responsibility. It exposes where it already lived. This is why founders are shocked. They expect structure to activate under pressure. Institutions expect structure to already be active. Many entrepreneurs believe time resolves uncertainty. Institutions believe time increases risk. The longer authority is unclear, the more institutions restrict action. And that's not hostility. It's containment. And containment protects the system from making the wrong assumption. And when forced to choose between preserving flexibility or preserving certainty, institutions always choose certainty, which usually means less movement, not more. Every stress event produces the same outcome. The institution decides whether the business is separate or personal. Not partially, not temporarily. For the duration of that event, determination is made. And that determination is based entirely on history. Not promises, not explanations, not corrections made mid-crisis. History. Stress doesn't punish structure. It verifies it. If separation existed before pressure, it survives. If it didn't, stress simply makes that visible. In the final section, we'll step back and look at how institutions make the ultimate determination, separate or personal, and why that determination rarely changes once it's made. By the time an institution reaches this stage, It's no longer gathering information. It's making a determination. Not a suggestion, not a recommendation, a determination. This section explains how that determination is reached, why it rarely changes, and why most entrepreneurs never realize it's already been made. Institutions observe first. They collect behavior, they trace authority, they review history. But observation doesn't last forever. At a certain point, uncertainty becomes risk, and risk demands resolution. That's when institutions stop asking questions and start assigning positions. Separate or personal. There's no third category. The determination is not based on intentions, explanations, post-event corrections, or promises of future compliance. It's based on precedent. What happened consistently before pressure arrived? Who acted? Who decided? Who intervened? Who absorbed consequence? Institutions trust patterns more than statements. Patterns are reliable. Statements, well, they're negotiable. And that's why late explanations fail. They arrive after the pattern is already visible. Institutions decide once behavior stops being ambiguous or being capable of more than one meaning. After that point, structure is classified. Once a determination is made, changing it is difficult. Not because institutions are stubborn, but because reversal introduces risk. If an institution reclassifies a business from personal to separate, it has to explain why the previous behavior no longer applies. That explanation has to be stronger than the evidence that created the original determination. And most businesses can't meet that standard quickly. Consistency over time is required. Time under observation, time without exception, time without personal intervention. And until then, the safest position remains the original one. Entrepreneurs feel blindsided because the determination is not announced loudly. There's no formal declaration, no warning letter, no dramatic moment. The determination shows up indirectly in what is frozen, in what is denied, in what requires additional approval, in what suddenly needs personal involvement. By the time this happens, the decision has already been made. The institution is no longer asking the business if it's separate. It's acting as if it's not. This is the reality most people never hear. Institutions don't need perfect separation. They need credible separation. And credibility comes from consistency. Consistency comes from behavior. Behavior comes from authority being transferred and staying transferred. When that happens, the separation is recognized. When it doesn't, separation is ignored. Not challenged, ignored. This entire episode has been about one question: why your business never became separate from you. Not as an accusation, not as a failure, as an explanation. Separation isn't created by filing. It's created by authority leaving the individual and remaining with the structure. Institutions don't wait for you to declare that shift. They watch for it. And once they stop seeing it, they decide accordingly. Not with instructions, not with solutions, but with clarity about how separation is actually recognized.